one thing that's become quite clear is that a lot of the problems that the West is facing, Western countries are facing, comes down to the takeover of the general consciousness by woke ideology, by left-wing woke ideology that favors mass migration, has this belief that all human values are universally shared amongst all human beings on the planet. And in the UK, for example, even to the extent that wealth is bad, a lot of people seem to inherently hate wealth. And they believe that people who are wealthy are not necessarily evil, but are benefiting off the slave labor of those less fortunate than them. Because that's the other thing they see about wealth, which is that if you're wealthy, then it's because you're lucky, it's because you have the good fortune of having made that wealth. But the thing is, of course, luck, applies to everybody. We're all lucky for being alive. And the amount of people who believe that wealth can be acquired through hard work is a shrinkingly small number of people. And that's why it has that viewpoint in the UK. And it's a very socialist kind of way of viewing the world. And it's why a lot of people support this idea of a wealth tax now. It sounds good on the surface, but when you start to think about it, it's not really practical. Even if you think it's correct, it's not really practical because wealth can easily move away. It's very difficult to administer. It's very punitive. It requires people to cash in unrealized gains, which itself would be very, very destructive to a lot of startups, for example, and to a lot of other investments in general. But again, it's this sort of left-wing view of the world and sort of linked to critical race theory and wokeism and all these other things, all these other ideologies that have seemed to have taken over in the West over the last few decades. And when I zoom out and look at it, I was asking myself, why is that? Why was such an ideology which has elements that just go against reality, why would something like that be able to take over? And it's because people are not thinking critically about things. It's so easy to get caught up in an idea. We all do that, right? Because we're all human, we're all easily influenced by ideas if they're packaged in a very attractive manner. Nevertheless, we get an education. We're educated, we're taught by our parents, our society, we're taught at school. We ought to be taught how to think for ourselves, to critically analyze things. And some of us do get that kind of education, depending on what we study. Now, if more people were to critically think about things, then I believe people would be able to make better decisions in terms of who they vote for. And people would also be able to make better decisions in their life in general, not just for themselves, but for society. So I'm talking even about the politicians who run countries. Why is it that Ed Miliband is pursuing net zero so fanatically? Because he believes in it, right? In his heart. He believes in the idea of being carbon neutral, of trying to solve climate change. Never mind the fact that the UK's CO2 emissions are less than 1% of the global amount. Because if you look at it from that point of view, you realize that the UK becoming net zero doesn't really impact the climate as much. The only reason you'd want to pursue this implementation is if it gives the UK some kind of competitive advantage in the world. I mean, yes, of course, it's nice to be a net zero country, but if your objective is to help solve climate change, well, it's not really going to do much, given the small percentage that its output is. But if we're building technologies that we can sell to other countries and companies and make money from, then sure, it's worth doing. He's just doing it for ideological reasons. Now, interestingly, he sells it in a different way now. He says, well, it's going to create jobs, it's going to create jobs. And then I think to myself, well, if that's the case, why don't you just build normal power stations and thereby enable manufacturing like we used to have? Because wind farms actually will lead to deindustrialization because they can't guarantee to provide power at all times. But anyway, I digress. My general point is that sort of thinking, his fanatical desire to make this happen, comes about because of a lack of critical thinking. A lack of critical thinking. Critical thinking doesn't just mean being able to analyze the ins and outs of something and know the details. It means being able to look at the alternative opposing points of view fairly and consider them as well. And this isn't just about alternative points of view that are presented to you. This is also about your own thinking in your mind. I think being willing to be wrong and being able to admit when you're wrong is really important. I find it hard to do because I'm like most people. I have an ego, right? But I try to do it. And even online on X, I've had conversations with people where they've said something that I didn't know about, and then I've had to correct myself. And I've admitted it. And it's not easy because people then, crap on you and they say, ha ha ha, whatever. But it feels better actually in the end because now I know my information is more accurate. So critical thinking is about analyzing things in detail and analyzing opposing points of view. And then that's how you get a better picture of what's really true and what's really going on. And if you can't do that, or if you don't do that, then you're simply going to be thinking the thoughts that other people have given you, which is, I think, how woke ideology has come to become so dominant. Why it is that people are even asking the question of whether trans women should be allowed into women's bathrooms, or why people push puberty blockers on children, right? Despite the fact that there's a lot of mental problems, there are a lot of mental problems for people who transition. And then, the assumption is, well, it's because society doesn't expect them. Well, no, it's trans people have been around for a long time. This is something different. This is because people are being pushed into a course of action under an assumption that that's the right answer for them without first analyzing what their specific problem is. I mean, this was the thing that came out in that report about transitioning children. It was saying that what they need first and foremost is therapeutic help, mental health services, instead of just being recommended to transition, even though they feel like that might be what they want to do. So that's a critical thinking approach to it. It's not just looking at the surface, but looking below and trying to understand what's really going on. And I think being an investor, for example, is similar. You don't just read the news to see what's going to happen. You want to look under the hood. You want to understand how systems work in order to be able to predict what's going to happen in a market, what's going to happen in a country, what's going to happen in the world. Anybody who wants to predict the future, or anybody who wants to understand the world better, has to do this. And when we start thinking critically, it's interesting. You end up not being either left-wing or right-wing. You end up being a bit more centrist. In fact, there's no reason to even put a label on it, because really what it comes down to is the truth. Because that's what I think critical thinking really gets you. It gets you to the truth. And it's something that I've spoken about in earlier videos. Why I think the UK is suffering so much is because people and politicians and the media have either refused to look at the truth or been unable to see the truth. And so they've been living with fantasy ideas, with make-believe ideas. And if people valued critical thinking, and if people valued knowing the truth, these things wouldn't have happened. But the truth can be uncomfortable. That's the thing. Critical thinking can be uncomfortable, especially when you try to see things from the opposition's point of view. But you have to remind yourself that your objective is to find the deeper truth. And the deeper truth actually results in more intelligence and better decisions. So it is worth it. But in order for us to have people thinking critically, we have to educate them to think critically. And we have to create and we have to encourage a culture of critical thinking. The election of Donald Trump is interesting because I think a lot of his supporters aren't critical thinkers. I like aspects of Donald Trump. I especially like the cultural changes that are coming about, specifically the reduction in DEI. I do not like DEI. I completely disagree with it. And the shift away from this focus on transgenderism and a shift towards a more realpolitik view of the world, which is power ultimately speaks with authority. Europe is pissed off right now. Well, European leaders are pissed off that the Americans aren't working with them like they used to. America's almost looking down on them. I mean, I'm talking about members of the American administration, not necessarily the people. And the Europeans are just aghast at this. But when you step back and look at the details and look at the system, you realize, well, most European countries are vassal states to America. And Europe has been freeloading off American military power for a long time. So in a way, it's not surprising. All that's changed is that now you have an administration in power in America who openly say these things and who are not happy with things being this way. So instead of Europe complaining about it, Europe needs to look at the reality and see, you know what? We need to be powerful. We need to be sovereign. We need to stand on our own 2 feet. And then it won't matter if somebody else lets us down in terms of our expectations. And we can then deal with that from a position of strength. Anybody who's critically thinking about geostrategic power should be thinking in these terms. It doesn't matter how many alliances you have. It doesn't matter what agreements are made or special relationships or historical, cultural alignment. Ultimately, it comes down to power and leverage. That's how the world works. And so that's how you should operate. So that's just another example of how critical thinking and facing the truth would result in a better outcome for you, for your people, for your country, and honestly for the world at large.